My name is Naomi Calloway, and I want you to know something before I tell you this story. I was not always strong. I was not always the woman who could sit across from a man who shattered her world and smile without flinching. I was not always the one with the plan, the patience, the nerve. There was a version of me who cried in parking lots, who ate cereal for dinner because cooking felt impossible, who stared at the ceiling at 2 a.m. listening to her 7-year-old daughter's labored breathing and prayed to God she wouldn't have to call 911 again. That version of me existed. She was real. She was exhausted. But that woman, she's gone now. What's left is me. And I've got a story to tell you. It started with a diagnosis. It ended with a dynasty. And in the middle was a man who made the worst mistake of his entire privileged, pathetic life. He underestimated me. My daughter's name is Isla. She was 8 years old when Dr. Priya Mehta sat us down in that sterile little room at Northwestern Memorial in Chicago and said the words that restructured my entire reality. Congenital aortic stenosis, severe. Surgery required, not optional. The valve was barely functioning. Without the procedure, we were looking at heart failure within 6 months. I didn't cry in the office. I held Isla's hand. She had a purple scrunchie in her hair and she was wearing her favorite shirt, the one with the little foxes on it. And she looked up at me with those big brown eyes. Not scared, just watching my face to decide if she should be scared. I kept my face still. I waited until I got to my car. Then I sobbed like something inside me cracked open, both hands on the wheel, chest heaving, for 9 full minutes. I know it was 9 because the radio was on and 2 full songs played and half of a third. Then I wiped my face, fixed my mascara in the visor mirror, and drove us to Dairy Queen because Isla said she wanted a blizzard. And honestly, my baby could have a blizzard every single day for the rest of her life if I had anything to say about it. The surgery was going to cost $240,000 after insurance. My insurance was garbage, a high deductible plan I'd been paying into for 3 years through my job as a digital marketing manager at a mid-sized firm in the Loop. After what they'd cover, I was looking at $87,000 out of pocket. I had $14,000 in savings. I had a small condo with not much equity. I had a car with 3 years left on the loan. I had one other option, Isla's father. His name is Declan Whitmore, and if you live in Chicago's North Shore circles, you know that name. Old money with new ambition. His grandfather built Whitmore Capital. His father grew it. Declan was supposed to be the golden continuation of that legacy. And for a long time, the world believed he was exactly that. 6'2", silver-streaked hair even at 41. Tailored suits from a guy in Milan he flew to see twice a year. A penthouse in Streeterville with views of the lake that would make you cry. A Porsche and a Range Rover and a boat he used maybe twice a summer. A wife, Vanessa, thin as a rail and sharp as a blade, who moved in the same social stratosphere and wore a diamond tennis bracelet that Declan had mentioned once, cost more than most people's cars. He and I had a thing 9 years ago. I was 26, a rising creative director at a boutique agency, and he was a client who kept accidentally ending up at the same events I attended. He was charming in the way that wealthy men learn to be charming, practiced, effortless, never quite sincere. We had 6 months of something that felt electric at the time and, in retrospect, was just a man with resources and availability taking advantage of a woman who was too ambitious and too lonely to see the transaction for what it was. When I found out I was pregnant, he wrote me a check. Not a child support check, a check he called assistance. He was not married yet. He was just uninterested. He asked me to keep quiet, to not involve lawyers, and in exchange, he would take care of things. I should have lawyered up then. I know that now. But I was 27, terrified, and he was Declan Whitmore. I told myself I didn't want his money. I told myself Isla and I would be fine on our own. And for 8 years we were, until we weren't. I called him on a Tuesday. He didn't pick up. His assistant called me back. I said his daughter needs open heart surgery and I need to speak with him. There was a pause. Then, Mr. Whitmore will call you Thursday. He didn't call Thursday. He called Sunday, 8 days after Isla's diagnosis, 4 days after I'd started losing sleep doing the math on second mortgages and medical financing plans with 22% interest rates. I picked up on the second ring. Naomi. His voice was the same, smooth, measured, the voice of a man who had never once been truly afraid of anything in his life. I heard about the situation with the little girl. The little girl. Not Isla, not my daughter, the little girl. That told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. But I breathed through it. I laid out the facts, diagnosis, surgery date, cost breakdown, what I had, what I needed. I was calm, I was organized. I'd practiced the conversation 4 times in the mirror. I need $73,000, I said. I'll put in everything I have, that covers the gap. There was a long pause. Let me think about it, he said. He asked me to come to his office. He said he wanted to discuss the details in person. He said, and I will never forget this, I like to handle sensitive matters face to face. I said fine. I said Tuesday at 2. I had no idea he was going to ask me to bring Isla. The Whitmore Capital offices are on the 43rd floor of a building on Walker Drive, with a lobby that has a waterfall feature and marble floors, and security guards in suits who look like they went to the same charm school as Declan. I wore a good blazer, black, my best heels. I had my hair pressed and laid. I was not going to let him look down on me. Isla wore her fox shirt again. I braided her hair. She held my hand in the elevator and looked out at the city through the glass and said, "Mama, we're higher than the birds." I said, "Yeah, baby, we are." His assistant, a young woman named Chloe, who clearly had a resting expression of carefully suppressed discomfort, walked us back to a corner conference room. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a long table with 12 leather chairs, a side credenza with sparkling water in little glasses arranged on a tray. Declan came in 2 minutes after we sat down. He was wearing a navy suit. His tie was a deep burgundy. He looked expensive and put together, and he barely glanced at Isla before sitting across from me and folding his hands on the table like we were in a board meeting. "Naomi," he said, "thank you for coming." I said, "Thank you for seeing us." He pulled out a folder, started talking about documentation and paternity and legal exposure. Said if we were going to discuss financial support of any kind, he needed to make sure it wasn't going to open a door to further claims. Said his lawyers had advised him to proceed carefully. His lawyers. For his daughter's heart surgery. I sat there listening to this man discuss legal liability while his child, his blood, his 8-year-old daughter with a defective heart valve and a purple scrunchie and a fox shirt, sat 2 feet away drawing little stars on the back of a business card she'd found on the credenza. And then he said it. He looked at me, not at Isla, at me, and said, "Honestly, Naomi, you made your choices. I told you 9 years ago I wasn't in a position to be a father. You decided to move forward with the pregnancy. That decision and all of its consequences are yours. You should have aborted. That's just the truth. And I'm not going to be financially responsible for a situation you created." He said it, clearly, in that glass room, with Isla sitting right there. She looked up from her business card. She wasn't drawing anymore. She was looking at him, this man she'd never met, this stranger in the fancy suit with those big brown eyes. And she said, very quietly, "Are you my daddy?" Declan Whitmore didn't answer her. He looked back at me and said, "I think we're done here." First, I handled Isla, because Isla was the whole point. The surgery was scheduled for March 14th. I had 11 weeks. I filed for emergency child support through the Cook County Family Court System. I hired a family law attorney named Reginald Foster. I found him through a colleague, a black attorney out of the South Loop with a reputation for being aggressive and precise. And Reginald filed a paternity establishment petition alongside the support motion. He requested a court-ordered DNA test. Declan's lawyers, of course, contested immediately. I expected that. Reginald expected that. And while their legal team bought time and filed motions and scheduled hearings, I worked the other angle. Chloe was gold. She wasn't willing to go on record, not yet, but she told me things. She told me that Serena, the attorney, was still in the picture, had been for 3 years, and that Declan had bought her an apartment in Lincoln Park. She told me about a meeting he'd had in November with a hedge fund manager named Garrett Tully that nobody at Whitmore Capital knew about, and that she'd accidentally typed up notes from that meeting before Declan realized she'd been in the anteroom. She had those notes. She had kept them for her own protection. She also told me that Vanessa, Mrs. Whitmore, was not as oblivious as she appeared. Vanessa had a therapist, a personal attorney, and an aunt who was a forensic accountant. Chloe had intercepted enough to know that Vanessa had been quietly preparing her own exit for at least a year. She's waiting for the right moment, Chloe told me. She doesn't want to just leave. She wants to take what's hers. I thought, maybe Vanessa and I should have a conversation. So I reached out. Not directly. I went through a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Bridget who moved in North Shore circles and who I'd met at a fundraiser 3 years prior. I asked Bridget if she could arrange an informal coffee, framed as a real estate connection since Vanessa was known to invest in Chicago properties. Bridget, who was herself not a fan of Declan and had her own reasons for that, made a call. Vanessa Whitmore met me at a small Italian cafe in Evanston on a Thursday morning. She arrived 7 minutes early, ordered an Americano, and studied me over the rim of her cup with eyes that were sharp and appraising and entirely unsurprised. "I know who you are," she said, before I'd said anything beyond hello. "I've known about Isla for 2 years. I hired a PI in 2022 when I found a wire transfer I couldn't account for." I stared at her. She stared at me. And then very slowly, she smiled. Not warmly, but genuinely. The smile of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for an ally to walk through a door. "Tell me what you need, and I'll tell you what I have. And then let's figure out how to make sure What Vanessa had was comprehensive. 4 years of marriage, no prenup. A fact that Declan had apparently believed was balanced out by her reasonable temperament, which I interpreted to mean he'd assumed she'd be too proud and too comfortable to fight. She had documentation of his affair with Serena going back 2 years, including hotel receipts in her name that she'd recovered from his personal email. The password to which she'd obtained in the first year of their marriage, and he'd never once changed. She had screenshots, dates, a pattern of cash withdrawals that her aunt, the forensic accountant, had traced to Serena's Lincoln Park apartment payments. She also had something I hadn't known about. Declan had a partner in the Whitmore Capital business, a man named Felix Oduya, who had been with the firm for 15 years. Felix was ethical in the way that only people who have been watching something go wrong for a long time can be. Quietly, carefully ethical, building a file. Felix had gone to a securities attorney 6 months ago. He hadn't filed anything yet. He was waiting to see if the board would act first. Vanessa was close with Felix's wife. She made a call. Felix agreed to meet with us, and that meeting, that quiet dinner at Felix's house in Kenwood with his wife Maya's red beans and rice on the table and Felix's printed out documentation spread across the kitchen counter, that was the moment I understood that what we were building was not just a survival strategy. It was a case, a full, documented, airtight case. Securities fraud, undisclosed conflicts of interest, commingled funds, off-books accounts routed through a shell entity registered in Delaware that traced back to a fabricated management company. The kind of thing that, presented to the right people at the right time, doesn't just result in civil penalties, it results in federal charges. March 14th. I want to talk about this part more than any other part because it is the center of everything, the reason everything else exists, the thing that all of this was always about. The surgery was funded. Reginald had pushed through an emergency temporary support order. A judge had looked at Isla's medical records, looked at the DNA test results that came back in 6 weeks confirming Declan's paternity, looked at Declan's annual income of $3.4 million, and signed an emergency order requiring him to pay the surgical costs pending the full support hearing. His lawyers had tried to delay. The judge had not been moved. Declan paid, not because he wanted to, because a judge told him to, and even Declan Whitmore, for all his money and arrogance, understood that defying a court order for your sick child's heart surgery is not a good look even if you have excellent lawyers. Isla went into surgery at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours and 42 minutes. My mother flew in from Atlanta. My best friend Taryn sat on my left and held my hand for most of it. I drank 4 cups of terrible hospital coffee. I did not look at my phone once because I had decided that nothing on my phone mattered until my daughter was out of surgery and okay. At 1:57 p.m., Dr. Metho walked through the doors in her scrubs and found my eyes across the room and smiled. "She did beautifully," she said. "Everything went exactly as planned. She's in recovery and asking for you." I put my face in my hands. My mother started crying. Taryn said, "Thank God," loud enough that people turned to look. And I sat there for a moment in that plastic hospital chair, and I thought, she's okay. She's okay. And then, almost immediately after, now we finish this. Isla spent 5 days recovering in the hospital. I was there every night. She watched the entire first season of a cartoon about a girl detective on my laptop. She ate an embarrassing amount of Jell-O. She made friends with the 11-year-old in the next room who had the same surgeon. She was, as she has always been, extraordinary. On day 3, she asked me if the man from the office was going to come see her. I told her probably not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I feel a little sorry for him. He doesn't know what he's missing." And she went back to her cartoon like she'd said something completely ordinary. 8 years old. My God. By April, we were ready. Vanessa filed for divorce first. Declan was served on a Wednesday morning at his office, which Chloe had arranged by confirming his schedule in advance, and which Vanessa had specifically timed because she knew he had a client presentation that afternoon with investors he'd been cultivating for 2 years. He had to walk into that presentation 2 hours after being served. Chloe said he was not himself in that meeting. Felix, simultaneously, delivered his documentation to the SEC's Chicago regional office, not to the board. Felix had decided after much deliberation that the board had known enough and done nothing long enough that going to the board first was simply giving Declan a chance to manage the narrative. The SEC received a full package: documented transactions, bank records, the Delaware Shell Company, cross-referenced with Whitmore Capital's disclosed filings. The SEC opened a formal investigation within 3 weeks. Reginald, for his part, had prepared a very thorough filing for the full support hearing that included a lifestyle analysis, a detailed document showing Declan's actual expenditures, assets, properties, and income streams versus what he had disclosed in the original support response. The gap was significant. Reginald intended to make the gap very clear to the judge. And then there was the story. I had thought a long time about whether to go to the press. I'm not someone who wants to be a public figure. I don't want Isla's story turned into content. But I also understood something about powerful men and accountability. Institutional processes move slowly, and public pressure moves them faster. And there was a journalist, a woman named Priscilla Wendt, who wrote for a Chicago-based investigative outlet, who had been looking into Whitmore Capital's real estate dealings for 8 months. She reached out to Chloe. Chloe referred her to me. I spoke to Priscilla on background initially, then on record, partially. I told her what I could verify and nothing I couldn't, and I made sure the story that ran was about the corporate misconduct and the failure of a man to support his ill child. Not a takedown piece, not a character assassination, but a factually documented account of specific things that had actually happened. Priscilla is very good at her job. The piece ran in May. By the time it published, Declan Whitmore's life was already falling apart at the seams. The piece didn't cause the collapse. It just made sure the right people were watching when it happened. Let me be precise about what happened to Declan Whitmore, because I don't want to be vague or dramatic about it. The facts are September 22nd, family court, Cook County. I wore the same black blazer. Reginald was thorough and prepared and methodical. He walked the judge through a lifestyle analysis that documented $3.8 million in annual personal expenditures, property holdings across 3 states, a vacation property in Harbor Springs, investment accounts totaling approximately $11 million in personal assets, all against the backdrop of a man who had argued in his support response that his current financial situation made the requested support amount unreasonable. Declan's attorneys tried to argue that the ongoing SEC investigation created uncertainty about future income. The judge said that uncertainty about future income was not grounds to reduce support for an existing child with documented medical needs. Declan did not look at me once during the hearing. He looked at the table. The judge ordered $18,500 per month in child support, retroactive to Isla's birth. Retroactive. 8 years of it. A lump sum that his attorneys immediately began negotiating terms on, but that the court had ordered. The surgical costs had already been covered by the emergency order. The full support going forward was more than I had asked for. The judge had looked at the lifestyle documentation and looked at Declan Whitmore's apparent choices about where his money went, and had made a decision accordingly. Reginald shook my hand outside the courtroom. "You did good," he said. "You did real good." I called my mother. She cried. I let her. Then I drove to Isla's school and picked her up and took her to her favorite Thai place on Clark Street and watched her eat her pad CE with complete focus and contentment. And I thought about the 8 years before this, all the cereal dinners and 2 a.m. ceiling staring sessions and parking lot crying, and I thought about where we were now. Isla had a scar on her chest that was healing beautifully. Her most recent cardiology check was remarkable. Dr. Metha had used that exact word, remarkable. She was running in gym class. She was doing a science fair project about cardiac anatomy because, as she explained, "I want to know about my own heart, Mama." She was extraordinary. She was mine. Here is the part where I tell you what happened to me. Not to Declan, to me. Because this story is not ultimately about a man. It is about what happened. In February, almost a year to the month after Isla's surgery, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "This is Declan. I'd like to speak with you. I owe you an apology." I read it 3 times. I thought about not responding. I considered that option seriously for about 4 days. But then I thought about Isla, who had asked twice in the past year whether her daddy knew she was doing okay, who had, in the completely unsentimental and purely pragmatic way of children, decided that she didn't need him to be a good father, but she might want to know him someday, when she was old enough to make that call herself. So I responded. I said we could talk. I said I chose the time and place, and there would be no lawyers present. He agreed. We met at a coffee shop in Andersonville, not somewhere he would have chosen. No marble lobbies, no Wacker Drive views. A neighborhood place with mismatched chairs and a blackboard menu and good light in the afternoon. He looked different. The silver-streaked hair was the same, but something else was gone. The ease, maybe. That particular quality of a man who has never had to account for himself. He had on a regular jacket, not a suit. He ordered a regular coffee. "I want to say I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said in front of Isla. That was... He stopped. There's no way to make that okay. I know that. I looked at him across the table. I don't need your apology, I said, but Isla might someday. If she decides she wants a relationship with you, I won't stand in the way of it. That's her choice to make, not mine. But it has to be real, consistent, present, not a check and a birthday card. Real. And if you aren't capable of that, then stay away from her, because she is not available to be disappointed by you. He nodded. He seemed to be listening in a way he had never listened before. Possibly for the first time in his life, Declan Whitmore was in a room where he was not the most powerful person at the table. He said, I'd like to try, if she's willing. I said, that's not up to me. I picked up my cup and drank my coffee, and I looked out the window at the February street. Gray sky, people in puffy coats, a dog pulling at a leash, and I thought about a Tuesday morning in a glass conference room and an 8-year-old girl drawing stars on a business card, and a man who said she should never have existed. And I thought about what she'd said in the hospital 3 days after her heart had been repaired. He doesn't know what he's missing. She was right then, she is right now. I walked out of that coffee shop into the cold Chicago air, and I called Isla on the way to my car, and she answered on the second ring and said, Hi, Mama, guess what? I got 100 on my science test. And I said, Of course you did, baby, of course you did. And I was laughing, and the sky was doing that thing it does in February in Chicago, where the light comes through gray and flat and still manages to be beautiful. And I thought, we won. Not just the court case, not just the surgery, not just the business, the stability, the Thursday coffees with a woman who became an unexpected ally, the nights that don't feel impossible anymore. We won the thing that was always actually at stake. The life. Our life. Mine and Isla's, built from scratch, built by hand, built in spite of every single person and circumstance that said we shouldn't have it. Declan Whitmore had money and a building with a waterfall in the lobby and a boat he barely used and an apartment for a woman who was only ever a transaction and a board that trusted him and a firm his grandfather built, and he threw all of it, every single piece, into the machinery of his own arrogance. And I had a kid with a fox shirt and a repaired heart who got 100 on her science test. I think you know who won.